Hey guys, tonight we drift back through the hazy candlelight of medieval chambers and creaky castle halls to explore the quietly bizarre fates of those who, believe it or not, died in their sleep in some of the strangest ways you've never heard of. We're calling this one the Sleepy Knight's Demise, and if you've ever worried about eating a little too much before bed, well, let's just say Sir Edric of the Rotting Hills probably agrees. Imagine it now, you're lying on your hay-stuffed mattress, full belly, maybe one mead too many, the wind rattling your wooden shutters. Somewhere in the next chamber, someone snores like a rusted bellows. That someone is Sir Edric, a once proud knight of middling competence, blessed mostly with decent cheekbones and an excellent lineage of pointy boots. His final moments, snoring loudly, and then silence. The tale begins after a feast. Of course, there's always a feast. Edric, tired from jousting badly and juggling debts even worse, consume what one scribe described as a heroic portion of goose, elderberry tart, and fermented root beer-like beverage. Goose was a delicacy, rich and fatty, and medieval folks didn't count calories, they counted belt loops. Sometime just after midnight, Edric retired to his chamber with the quiet contentment of a man who believed indigestion was a sign of wealth. What followed was a death so undramatic that it became folklore. He simply stopped breathing, face down, tunic slightly askew, a candle still flickering at his bedside, and like that, the legend of the knight who was slain by his supper was born. Historians still argue whether Edric's demise was due to sleep apnea, a heart attack, or simply the combination of overeating and poor sleeping posture. There's actually a woodcut of the man face down with a comment in Latin which roughly translates to, "Gravity, thy foe art heavy meats." In the Middle Ages, death in sleep was both feared and revered. Some saw it as a blessing to die in God's arms, they said, but others suspected darker things, especially when it happened to nobles, who were rarely allowed peace in life, let alone a suspiciously peaceful death. Edric's chamber servant, a woman named Alisun, claimed she heard what sounded like humming just before the snoring stopped, humming as in from something not human. This kicked off rumors that Edric's death was due to a night demon, a common scapegoat in medieval folklore. You know the type: horns, hooves, and a fondness for mildly sinful nappers. Of course, the local clergy couldn't let this one pass uninvestigated. They proclaimed Edric's sin wasn't gluttony, but pride. He had recently commissioned a particularly gaudy stained glass window in the church featuring himself kneeling with suspiciously well-toned arms. A prideful knight. You can practically hear the monks rolling their eyes. His death became a cautionary tale for overeaters and the vain, rolled into one. There's even an old lullaby that mentions him, something mothers whispered to children. Too wired on honey bread to sleep, Sir Edric dozed, and so he died, with jam upon his chin. Sleep ye now with humble heart, and keep your goose within. Sleep, in the Middle Ages, wasn't always the simple, uninterrupted affair we imagine. The notion of sleeping through the night in one long chunk is a relatively modern invention. Back then, people often experienced first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period in between to pray, talk, or you guessed it, snack on whatever was left from dinner. Edric had no such middle night break. 1 minute dreaming of fame and roast swans, the next flatlining into legend. And let's not forget the mattress. Edric's bed was reportedly stuffed with dried moss and poultry feathers, luxurious, but probably not ergonomic. He slept on his stomach, arms out like a fallen pine. Some scholars suggest this position, combined with overeating and possibly undiagnosed sleep apnea, sealed his fate. Others point to a more dramatic culprit: spontaneous digestion failure, a charming euphemism for he just kind of stopped. Modern reenactors have tried to recreate Edric's last meal. By the way, the results: indigestion, guilt, and one mild argument about elderberry sauce ratios, but none died yet. What makes Edric's death so strange isn't that he died in his sleep, it's how completely dull it was. No war wound, no poisoned goblet, not even a tragic tumble from a horse. Just a man, asleep, maybe dreaming of tournaments he never won, crushed under the weight of overcooked goose and overinflated ego. You shuffle past the legend now, perhaps lingering at his lopsided tomb, a marble knight with eyes closed, hands still clutching a turkey leg. You might smile. The Middle Ages loved a moral, and Edric's is clear pace yourself at dinner and never sleep in your armor. You wander further into the drafty echoes of medieval hallways, your footsteps padding over rush-strewn floors. You pass a cracked wooden door where candlelight flickers low, casting long shadows on the wall. Inside lies another tale, one colder than goose fat and twice as strange. This is the legend of the nun who froze in prayer, a story equal parts devotion, mystery, and hypothermia. She was called Sister Marriott, born to a minor noble family, and likely shipped off to the convent not for her piety, but because her brothers didn't want to split the inheritance one more time. This was common practice. Second sons went to war, third daughters to the nunnery, and everyone else fought over sheep. Sister Marriott quickly developed a reputation in the abbey for being intense. She prayed longer than anyone else, fasted more strictly, and spoke only in whispers, even when it wasn't Lent. Her sisters admired her, feared her, or tried to avoid her when she got that 1,000-yard, staring at saints too long look. One winter's night, the abbey lost its main hearth fire, a mishap involving damp logs, a drunk friar, and a sheep that may or may not have knocked over the kindling. The nuns bundled into their cells, clutching woolen cloaks and each other, waiting for the morning sun and a dry spark. Marriott, naturally, refused such comforts. She insisted she must complete her vigil, kneeling before the chapel's altar from matins through lauds. The chapel, mind you, was stone, no windows, the kind of place where even rats wore little fur-lined habits. Morning came, the nuns tiptoed in, and there she was still kneeling, still hands clasped, still eyes closed, but stiff, as in frost-laced veil, icicle lashes, and the faint smell of frozen incense. Aborgias. Historians still argue whether Mariotte died from simple exposure, or if she had a fainting episode during prayer and couldn't rouse herself. One account, written years later by a bishop with a flair for drama, claimed that angels froze her into place as a symbol of unshakable devotion. Others whispered she had visions so intense, she simply forgot to live. It gets weirder. Her body was reportedly warm to the touch for 3 days, except her feet, which were rock solid. The abbess, unsure of whether to bury or canonize her, decided on neither. They encased her in beeswax and sat her up in the chapel corner, where she remained through 4 abbesses, 3 mouse plagues, and 1 lightning strike that mysteriously left her completely unscathed. The wax statue of Marriott became a minor pilgrimage spot. Though not officially sanctioned by the church, people came to rub her icy feet for blessings, farmers hoping for late frost, women praying for calm childbirths, and at least one traveling baker trying to cure chronic dough stickiness. Weird, but not unheard of. Medieval saints got associated with the strangest things. Remember Saint Scholastica rainstorms, Saint Apollonia toothaches, Sister Marriott cold feet, both literal and marital. One quirky tidbit buried in the abbey's surviving letters mentions that, for a time, the nuns claim Marriott's eyes would occasionally open slightly during night storms, not fully just a narrow parting, like a reluctant door. No one could prove it, of course, and one novice was transferred to a distant convent after fainting from fright during a particularly windy vigil. Theologically speaking, Marriott became something of a paradox. Some monks argued her death was a sign of unworldly virtue. Others said God wouldn't freeze his favorites. A third camp suggested She was simply a cautionary tale against excessive kneeling. That last one feels practical, but it speaks to how strange sleep and death in sleep was interpreted in the Middle Ages. Sleep wasn't just biological downtime, it was a liminal space, a dangerous space, a place where angels visited, demons whispered, and sometimes, just sometimes, the border between this world and the next cracked open like frost on old wood. Even Mariotte's funeral, once it finally happened, years later, was odd. They buried her in a casket carved from an old pulpit, draped with wool from sheep that had been raised on Abbey land. No one could remember where her original veil had gone. One theory, someone clipped a piece off for a relic and didn't tell the others. Another theory, the rats won. Today, no one really knows where her final resting place is. The abbey was abandoned during the plague, its stone quarried for a manor house, its grave markers long eroded. But there's a lonely field, somewhere outside Rouen, where wild violets grow thickest in winter. Locals call it La Vierge de Givre, the Frosted Virgin. You might smile, just a little, imagining Marriott sitting frozen in silent judgment of your 3 snooze-button mornings and fleece pajamas. She'd probably whisper something cryptic like, "The soul wakes as the flesh chills," and you'd back away slowly. Still, there's something comforting about the idea of a woman so committed to her sleep prayers that she literally froze doing it. Not heroic, not tragic, just strange. And in the slow hush of the night, strange stories like this feel perfectly at home. You shuffle onward, past a rusted gate and into another dimly lit corridor of the mind, where straw mats creak and the air smells faintly of iron and damp wool. Here, under flickering torchlight and the occasional whiff of boiled cabbage, you stumble into the tale of the peasant who died of laughter. And no, this isn't a setup to a joke, though it absolutely should be. His name was Gilles. No last name, just Gilles, and he lived in a thatched village somewhere in what is now southern France. It was the kind of place where the cows outnumbered the people, and the people outnumbered the teeth. Life was hard, sleep was precious, and dreams were often the only time peasants could imagine not being muddy. Gilles was known locally for his unusual optimism. That alone made him suspicious. In a world where people routinely dropped dead from stepping on the wrong mushroom or looking at a noble the wrong way, being cheerful raised eyebrows. He had a laugh like a bubbling stew pot and a habit of making rude rhymes about church sermons. Surprisingly, the priest found him amusing, but that was probably just because Gilles helped fix the chapel roof with minimal swearing. Now, here's where things take a turn. One day, a traveling performer arrived, an Italian jongleur named Marco, with a donkey named Cheese and a cart full of musical pots. Yes, musical pots. They made different notes when struck with sticks, and Marco played them like a drunk xylophonist who'd studied with goats. Naturally, the village gathered to watch, mostly for lack of better options. Marco told a joke no one remembers exactly what it was, but it supposedly involved a bishop, a chicken, and a misplaced candle. Gilles laughed, and kept laughing, and didn't stop. He laughed until he doubled over, until he gasped and wheezed, until he slid off the log he was sitting on and landed face first in a turnip. His body shook, his hands clawed at the ground, and then nothing. Stillness. Was it a stroke? A seizure? Historians still argue whether it was a neurological event, a rare heart condition, or simply an unfortunate alignment of humor and biology. Some believe Gilles suffered from what's now known as cataplexy, where extreme emotion causes the body to shut down. Others insist he had a supernatural sensitivity to joy. Either way, he didn't get back up. The villagers were stunned. The priest tried splashing him with holy water. One woman slapped him, twice, before anyone could stop her. Cheese, the donkey, licked his cheeks solemnly. But Gilles was gone, face frozen in a crooked grin, eyes half-lidded, like he'd finally understood the universe and found it just stupid enough to be funny. This, of course, set off a theological panic. Was laughing to death a sin? Was it divine punishment, a blessing? Did it count as a holy death if you expired during merriment? The village council debated this for 2 days and arrived at absolutely no conclusion. The priest decided to bury him with a loaf of bread and a wooden flute, just in case he needed to pass through the afterlife whistling. His grave marker was a flat stone carved with a single word, heh. And yet, his story lingered. For decades afterward, children were warned not to laugh too much, lest they Gilles themselves. Some say that during full moons, you could hear giggles from the field where he was buried. Skeptics blamed foxes. Believers blamed the joke. There's a strange echo here, though a connection between sleep and laughter, both forms of surrender. You can't force sleep, and you can't force a real laugh. They overtake you. They're involuntary, primal, slightly embarrassing, and in rare cases, terminal. One fringe tidbit from a 14th century herbal text, clearly written by someone either extremely bored or extremely inebriated, claims that laughing too much releases the spirit into God's jester's hands. This same text also recommends wearing garlic in your shoes to ward off nightmares, and says cabbage can cause impure dreams. Make of that what you will. It's easy to romanticize someone who dies laughing. We want to believe it means they went out in joy, like slipping quietly into a warm bath full of chuckles. But dying of laughter also reveals the thin line between amusement and madness, especially in the Middle Ages, where emotional restraint was expected, and spontaneous joy could look dangerously close to hysteria. Gilles, in his own odd way, defied the grimness of his era, while others feared death by plague, blade, or bureaucratic tax reclassification. He laughed himself straight into the history of weird endings. And honestly, that's not a bad way to be remembered, better than most nobles who just tripped over hunting dogs or mistook mercury for medicine. Today, the story of Gilles shows up in obscure folklore collections and the occasional sleepy footnote in psychology articles. Some claim his grave is a meadow now, full of wildflowers that seem to shake like they're snickering in the wind. Of course, that could also be the local sheep. You might wonder what exactly was the joke. Could it possibly still be funny, or would it fall flat now, like those medieval puppet shows where everyone just yells about sausages? Maybe that's the point. Maybe the mystery is funnier than the answer. So, next time you laugh too hard at something stupid like a duck in a hat or a medieval punishment involving eels, take a deep breath. Gilles is watching, and he's probably shaking his head from somewhere in the great beyond, still chuckling at whatever that chicken bishop joke was. You wander onward, past rows of drafty castles and candlelit bedchambers, toward the murky fate of a woman who simply wanted some shut-eye but found herself catapulted into legend. Her name, Margaretha of Austria, though not the famous one with a crown. No, this Margaretha was from a lesser-known noble house, the kind that had more titles than working fireplaces, and definitely fewer functional beds. Margaretha, like most women of status in 13th century Swabia, was expected to maintain a delicate equilibrium of grace, obedience, and not dying of dysentery. It wasn't an easy gig. You couldn't just curl up in a soft duvet with a hot cup of tea and dream of forest walks. Medieval pillows were mostly decorative sacks of hay, and the windows let in more weather than they kept out. Now, here's the strange part. According to a rather dusty monastery ledger, Margaretha once slept for 10 straight days. 10, no blinking, no meals, no muttered requests for wine. The servants thought she was dead. One even tried to measure her for a coffin. But on the morning of the 11th day, she simply sat up, yawned, and asked for stewed pears. Scholars still argue whether it was a coma, a spell, or some kind of proto-hibernation. One 19th century medical historian suggested it was a case of lethargica medievalis, a made-up Latin phrase that basically translates to She napped real hard. Others think she may have slipped into a diabetic coma, though the medieval diet didn't exactly overflow with sugar unless you were hoarding honeycombs. There's even a fringe theory involving sleep paralysis and divine visions. One monk wrote that Margareta had been called into the Garden of Angels, where time folds like laundry, not super scientific, but poetic. Regardless, this sleep caused a considerable ruckus. Her husband, Lord Heinrich of Bopfingen, was less concerned about her health and more about the optics. How could he host diplomatic feasts if his wife was drooling onto goose feathers? The bishop advised exorcism. The family physician suggested bathing her in goat milk, which led to a short-lived shortage and some very slippery floors. They even brought in a traveling apothecary who specialized in sleep disorders. He arrived in a cart shaped like a giant eyeball because subtlety wasn't invented until the Renaissance, and tried to wake her by waving burning sage over her feet. This resulted in nothing more than a charred blanket and a very annoyed chambermaid. When Margareta finally awoke, she claimed to have dreamed of a long corridor filled with whispering owls, staircases that led nowhere, and a violin-playing hedgehog. This was recorded, with serious intent, by a visiting scribe who apparently had a flair for fantasy and a complete disregard for skepticism. The court decided not to mention the hedgehog in public. It didn't pair well with politics. What's intriguing is how this tale influenced local beliefs about sleep. For years afterward, villagers would describe extra-long naps as Margareting, and some nobles even tried to imitate her for attention. There's a rumor that one minor duchess locked herself in a cellar for 4 days, hoping to gain the same sleepy mystique. Unfortunately, she woke up with a bladder infection and no suitors. The story of Margareta also wiggled into theological debates. Was sleep a gateway to the divine? Could dreams be messages from heaven? If so, why were half of them about falling endlessly or losing your teeth? Medieval theologians went wild with these questions. One abbot proposed that sleep was a form of passive worship, a sacred submission to God's will. Another dismissed that entirely, calling it lazy heresy, which is probably what he shouted at his students for nodding off during lectures. But here's a thought for you in a time when death was so sudden and ever-present. Maybe deep sleep was the one peaceful surrender people could actually control. Maybe it felt like a rehearsal for eternity, minus the judgment and harp music. And in that context, Margareta wasn't just a tired noblewoman. She was an accidental philosopher in a nightgown. Even centuries later, sleep researchers reference her in footnotes when exploring cases of pathological fatigue or idiopathic hypersomnia. Of course, her tale is wrapped in legend, now shaped and reshaped by scribes, storytellers, and probably one too many mugs of mead. One peculiar fringe note from a 14th century herbalist mentions that Margareta may have been bewitched by valerian vapors, suggesting her chamber had been steeped in sleep-inducing herbs. That same text also claims that if you rub crushed lavender on your elbows while chanting the Lord's Prayer backward, you'll dream of your future spouse. So, maybe not peer-reviewed, Margareta herself never spoke much of the incident again, perhaps because people kept asking awkward questions, perhaps because, deep down, she enjoyed the idea of having done nothing and yet still being remembered. And now, here you are, centuries later, drifting gently past her legend like a feather on the still air of a castle hallway. You imagine her lying still in that cold room, breathing evenly, surrounded by flickering candlelight and gossiping servants, not dead, not sick, just resting, monumentally. It makes you wonder if someone gave you the chance to escape for 10 days, just float in darkness without emails or errands or existential dread. Would you take it? Would you curl under the velvet and vanish into dreams of owls and hedgehogs and whatever it is your subconscious thinks is soothing? Or would you, like Heinrich, panic at the silence and try to fill it with noise and burning sage. You don't need to answer. The corridors of sleep are wide enough for both. You tiptoe past Margareta's velvet curtained bedchamber, through the cool hush of centuries, and into another equally peculiar episode of medieval slumber, only this one ends in a death so strange, you can't help but raise an eyebrow, even as your eyelids grow heavy. We're in the court of King Charles VI of France now, known less for his policies and more for the time he thought he was made of glass. Yes, glass. As in, please don't bump into me or I'll shatter. To be fair, Charles wasn't entirely alone in this. The glass delusion, as it's now charmingly labeled, struck several royals and nobles across Europe during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Historians still argue whether this was a psychological condition caused by extreme stress, early schizophrenia, or simply the product of an era that mixed trauma with alchemy and just a sprinkle of lead poisoning. Either way, King Charles would sometimes refuse to sit down without layers of cushions just in case his glass butt cracked. Now, Charles had another quirk. Like many royals, he loved elaborate masquerade balls, and one evening in 1393, he decided to host a spectacle called the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. You already feel where this is going, don't you? Imagine it, a grand hall filled with flickering torches, sweaty courtiers in absurd masks, and someone playing a lute with far too much enthusiasm. Charles and 5 of his closest buddies dressed as wild men of the woods, a common mythical trope at the time. They wore shaggy costumes of flax and pitch-coated linen, which, while delightfully authentic looking, were also entirely flammable. You can practically hear the fire marshal crying. The plan was simple: dance, frolic, scare the ladies a little, then reveal themselves with dramatic flair. But no one had counted on Louis of Orleans, Charles's brother, arriving fashionably late and drunk, holding a torch. One misstep, one errant flame, and suddenly the wild men were wildfires. Screams erupted. The torches turned into chaos. 4 of the dancers burned alive on the spot. Charles survived, thanks to the quick thinking of a duchess who smothered him with her heavy skirts, which, while deeply heroic, also sounds like the most uncomfortable rescue technique ever. And what does this flaming tragedy have to do with sleep? Well, here's the twist. According to chroniclers, Charles developed a terrifying fear of falling asleep after the incident. He believed that, in sleep, his body would melt, soften, and shatter. So, he stayed awake for days at a time, not out of productivity or strategy, just raw, unfiltered dread. The royal court scrambled. Herbal remedies were brewed by the gallon. One physician tried lullabies. Another dangled a pouch of owl feathers above his head, claiming they brought nocturnal serenity. Nothing worked. The king paced. He muttered. He stared into nothingness and whispered that sleep was a glass coffin. Eventually, he would crash sometimes for entire days, but never peacefully. Servants were instructed to keep their distance, and when he awoke, it was usually screaming. His bedchamber was redecorated multiple times in calming blues and greens, as if the color palette could override trauma. It couldn't. There's even one entry in the court records describing how Charles once asked to be locked in a padded room with no mirrors or windows, so that the dreams cannot find me. A monk theorized he was being punished by God for allowing dancing at court. Another blamed it on humors. Naturally, always the humors. One fringe report claims that the ghost of one of the burnt dancers visited him in dreams charred, faceless, and wordless. He just stands there, the king reportedly told his confessor, and then I feel heat on my back. Whether that's ghost story or grief hallucination, we'll never know. What we do know is this sleep in the medieval mind wasn't just rest, it was vulnerability. The veil between the body and the spirit grew thin. Dreams weren't just psychological fluff, they were messages, warnings, sometimes even prophecies. And if you were a king who already thought he might shatter, Why would you risk collapsing into that fragile twilight? Still, irony loves a good flourish. Charles, the sleepless king, eventually died in bed. No fire, no glass, just the stillness he'd feared for years. Today, psychologists look back on his case as one of the earliest documented examples of complex sleep phobia linked to PTSD. But to his contemporaries, he was a man cursed by folly and flames, punished for dressing like a forest goblin and dancing near open flames. You have to wonder, don't you, what the court astrologers were doing that night, probably arguing over which house Mars was in while the king's wig caught fire. And yet, even in all this madness, you can picture it, the hush that must have fallen after the flames died, the echo of music gone wrong, the sickly sweet smell of charred linen lingering as the king trembled in the arms of a duchess. He never hosted another masquerade. In fact, he spent the rest of his reign drifting in and out of mental clarity, one foot in the waking world and the other tangled in the thorns of insomnia, a royal sleepwalker in a kingdom always on edge. Tonight, as you pull your blanket a little tighter, imagine a candle flickering at the edge of that grand ballroom, smoke curling in the rafters, and a weary monarch peering into the dark, praying that sleep doesn't come for him. You, on the other hand, are far safer. No wild men, no torches, just the soft rhythm of breath and the quiet promise of dreams that don't burn. So you drift quietly from the charred ruins of Charles VI ballroom, away from all that flammable linen, and into the stone corridors of another grim medieval tale, this one whispered across taverns, scribbled in the margins of dusty manuscripts, and maybe, just maybe, dreamt into being by sleep-deprived monks. You're in Bologna now, the heart of medieval Italy, where scholarship and superstition went hand in hand like moldy cheese and stale bread. Here's where we meet the oddly tragic story of the man who died from holding in a sneeze. No, really. Now, to be fair, the sneeze wasn't the only issue. The man in question, known only by the frustratingly vague record name of Giovanni Di Luca, scribe of accounts, was reportedly sitting at a council meeting when the bishop entered the room. As custom dictated, everyone stood, removed their caps, and held still as the bishop offered a droning prayer that could have doubled as a sleep aid. But Giovanni, poor guy, had an issue. He felt a sneeze coming on, and here's the kicker: sneezing in front of clergy was seen by some as a bad omen, one that might signify disagreement, demonic presence, or just really poor manners. And if you'd like your sleep to be ruined by trivia, consider this: certain 13th century guides for etiquette even recommended pressing one's thumb to the upper lip with the mind of stilling the urge, because nothing screams elegance like thumb face in front of your boss. So Giovanni, eager not to offend, or perhaps worried about losing his station or head, did what he thought was noble. He tried to suppress it. Just a little hold, tighten the throat, close the mouth, stare at the floor. His face turned red, his ears pulsed, he started to tremble. Then, according to one monk's diary entry, a sound like a snapped wine flask echoed through the hall. Giovanni slumped to the floor, eyes wide, utterly lifeless. A silent room, then gasps, then chaos. The bishop thought it was divine punishment. The treasurer thought it was poison, but the apothecary, he calmly declared it, he hath perished from inward rupture. Now, whether you can actually die from holding in a sneeze, historians still argue whether this was a literal death or simply a dramatized tale of mid-meeting mortality. Modern doctors will tell you it's possible. A sneeze forcibly suppressed can cause ruptured blood vessels, eardrum damage, and in rare cases, internal bleeding. But death unlikely. Still, medieval medicine wasn't known for its nuance. He choked on the devil's wind was a perfectly valid diagnosis. The council, naturally, was horrified. From that day forward, official doctrine in Bologna's civic chambers declared sneezing a forgivable outburst, even encouraged. "It is better," wrote one clerk, "to blow the storm outward than let it drown within." And so, for years, scribes and aldermen were seen clutching handkerchiefs, or the medieval version probably a suspiciously stiff rag, at all formal meetings. Some would fake coughs just to hide real sneezes, while others bowed deeply in apology before and after any nasal expression. There are even records of sneeze blessing contests. Yes, you read that right where the bishop would rank who gave the most respectful "God bless you." But Giovanni's tale didn't fade. It became bedtime warning material, the kind your grandmother might whisper with a spoonful of lavender honey. Don't stifle your sneeze, or you'll end up like poor Giovanni, face first in the registry. A cautionary tale, not unlike those stories about swallowing gum and it staying in your belly for 7 years. Same energy. And what about his dreams? You wonder? The sleep of the sneezeless rumors floated for decades, that Giovanni was seen walking the halls at night, clutching his nose, lips trembling, that his ghost was heard exhaling violently into the cold Bolognese air, that a chill breeze would pass during late meetings in the same chamber, followed by a faint, breathy chew. Of course, no ghost story is complete without embellishments. One night, Watchman wrote that he found a goose feather on the ledger room floor, a symbol of either the Holy Spirit or a down pillow attack from beyond the veil. It's unclear, but this story nestles gently into the broader picture of how sleep and health were so deeply intertwined in the medieval mind. You couldn't just get sick, it had to mean something. Sin, imbalance, demonic interference, and dying in sleep. That was seen as either merciful or suspicious, depending on your social rank and how many enemies you'd made at the feast. The medical textbooks of the time, such as they were listed, sneezing as both a release of evil spirits and a defense against them. Some monks thought it was a sacred event. Others believed it opened your soul to possession. No wonder Giovanni was confused. The act of sleeping, like sneezing, was vulnerable. You weren't in control. Your spirit wandered. Your body lay still, exposed. If someone whispered your name while you slept, it could influence your dreams or even steal your breath, which might explain why entire villages once believed that nightmares were caused by demons sitting on your chest. Not very restful. In Giovanni's time, people often slept in shifts: first sleep, second sleep. Waking in the dark hours between them wasn't considered odd. It was expected. Maybe that's when the fear crept in. You lie awake, darkness heavy, body still warm from rest, and you wonder, what if I forget to breathe? What if a sneeze stops my heart? There's something deeply medieval about fearing your own lungs. The body was a mystery box, with its bile, phlegm, and vapors. Anything could go wrong, and it often did. So tonight, if your nose starts to tickle while you're drifting off, don't fight it, let it out, quietly. Of course, we are trying to relax here, but remember, better a gentle chew than a ghostly legacy of fear, formality, and fatal etiquette. And somewhere out there, in a candle-lit archive or the echoing vault of a forgotten council chamber, Giovanni is probably nodding in agreement, or at least sighing. You leave Bologna behind, trailing candlelight and ghost sneezes in your wake, and shuffle deeper into medieval Europe, where the line between dream and death gets blurrier with every strange tale. You're walking down a forested path, now mud sucking at your shoes, fog curling like lazy fingers around the tree trunks. Somewhere in the damp distance, bells toll, and as the sound carries through the woods, it leads you to one of the weirdest and most debated sleep deaths of the medieval period, the tale of the dancing plague of 1518. Yes, the dancing plague. No, not metaphorical dancing, not the joyful kind, either. This was real. This was terrifying. And it happened in Strasbourg, in what is now modern-day France. You arrive in the midst of chaos, People are gathered in the main square, clapping rhythmically, though there's no music, just the wet slap of soles on cobblestones. A woman, Frau Trophea, is spinning, wild-eyed, soaked in sweat. She's been dancing for hours. People look on, amused, then concerned, then horrified, because she won't stop. Neither will the others. Within a week, dozens of people are dancing too uncontrollably, spasmodically, day and night, sleep-deprived, starving, collapsing and waking only to flail again. Historians still argue whether this was mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from moldy rye, or something far more cultural and complex. Some say it started as a stress response post-famine, post-disease. People just snapped. Others think it was a curse. Religious leaders said it was divine punishment for sin, or maybe Saint Vitus's wrath. The town council, ever helpful, hired musicians and cleared space in the market square to give the dancers room, because when your population starts convulsing involuntarily, the obvious solution is a city-sanctioned dance floor. It didn't help. Within a month, nearly 400 people were dancing, and yes, some died from exhaustion, stroke, dehydration, maybe even sheer heartbreak. It wasn't a party, it was a physical trap they couldn't escape. People danced in their sleep. They collapsed, unconscious, and their limbs kept twitching, like puppet strings pulled by invisible hands. You can almost picture it now. Cobblestones slick with sweat, the air thick with incense and desperation. And yes, you're probably wondering, did they really die of dancing, or was it something else? The records are fuzzy. Some chroniclers wrote of sudden deaths on the street, others of madness overtaking the devout. No autopsies, of course, but modern theories abound. Ergot poisoning, as we said earlier, comes from a hallucinogenic mold and has been linked to both visions and muscle spasms. Sounds plausible, right? Except it usually causes convulsions and seizures, not hours-long rhythmic dancing. So maybe it was a kind of mass psychogenic illness where trauma and fear manifest physically, especially in close-knit, highly religious societies. Or maybe it was just medieval vibes, the kind where you wake up one day and your neighbor is pirouetting into a trance, and you think, sure, why not fringe theory alert? There are also a few scholars who wonder if this wasn't a resistance movement, a way to protest without protest, bodies speaking when words weren't allowed. Historians still argue whether the dancing was involuntary or something more ritualistic, a forgotten folk expression forced underground. Whatever it was, sleep became collateral damage. Imagine the toll. No one could rest. The town buzzed with tension. Even the watchers, the ones not dancing, reported nightmares and visions. Entire households reportedly passed nights without closing their eyes, terrified they'd start dancing in their dreams. To dream of rhythm, one priest warned, is to court the devil. The council eventually tried to intervene. They banned music. They shut down the square. They sent afflicted dancers to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. The journey uphill was supposed to purge the madness, and for some it did, but others simply collapsed along the way, never waking up again, peace by exhaustion. And like a fever breaking, the plague ended as strangely as it began. 1 week, dozens collapsed mid-spin. The next, silence. The square dried, the shrine emptied, life resumed, but not sleep. Even years later, people in Strasbourg spoke of the twitch that came at night, a sudden jerk before sleep, a dream of movement, a cold sweat. Generations of children were warned, if you dance too long in your dreams, you might never wake. Bedtime lullabies in the region even carried veiled warnings. One verse loosely translated, tiptoe, quick step, saintly tread. Dream too fast, you'll end up dead. Catchy, right? You start to notice that dance, in medieval symbolism, was often tied to death. Think of those dance macabre murals, the ones with skeletons leading kings and beggars alike into the grave with eerie little jigs. They weren't just spooky, They were reminders. Death comes for everyone. Might as well learn the steps. And so, sleep, supposedly the time of rest, was painted with dread. You close your eyes, and maybe your feet start moving. Maybe you rise without knowing it. Maybe your dreams turn into a rhythm you can't resist. But let's not get too carried away. There are gentler interpretations too. Some say the dancers were visionaries, caught in a spiritual ecstasy misunderstood by their peers, that their sleepless nights were filled not with horror, but transcendence, that they glimpsed something on the edge of waking that the rest of us never will. Maybe, or maybe they just needed a nap and a better diet. Still, when you lie in bed tonight, limbs warm beneath the sheets, and your foot twitches just slightly, don't panic. It's probably just your body saying goodnight. Probably, unless, of course, you hear faint music coming from nowhere. Then, maybe keep one eye open. You shuffle forward, past the spectral waltz of Strasbourg's Lost Sleepers, deeper into medieval minds where the threshold between life and death thinned dramatically, especially when the body went still. In these candle-lit centuries, you begin to notice something odd. People don't always stay dead. And that's not just superstition. Sometimes they get buried alive. It's not as rare as you'd hope. Bucko. Picture this. It's the middle of a grim November, and you're standing in a small English village where the churchyard is perpetually soggy. There's a young woman in the chapel, pale and motionless after 3 days of fever. Her family assumes she's past no pulse, no breath, just stillness. The local priest arrives, performs the rites, and before you know it, she's in the ground. And then, scratching, yes, scratching, thumping, even muffled screams if anyone's close enough to hear. Welcome to the medieval fear of premature burial. It happened often enough to earn its own niche in local folklore. Historians still argue whether it was a frequent occurrence or an exaggerated fear, but the paranoia was real. In an age with no stethoscopes, no brain scans, and a habit of mistaking comas or catatonic states for death, people were sometimes just a little too eager to seal the deal. You crouch beside a grave marker worn down by time and picture the scene underground. No coffin window, no bell string, just you, wrapped in your shroud, waking up 6 feet under, cozy. Right, some wealthier families tried to hedge their bets. They'd delay burials for 3 days just in case, or hire someone to poke the body with a stick now and then, essentially medieval CPR, minus the R. Fringe communities even believed in the death trance, a state where the soul briefly exits the body but returns later. Not superstition. They'd say just really bad timing. Eventually, in later centuries, safety coffins became a thing. These were basically anxiety boxes fitted with bells, flags, or even breathing tubes. You can thank the 18th century inventor Franz Vester for one particularly dramatic model, a coffin with a feeding pipe, a glass viewing window, and a ladder. Subtle, but let's not skip ahead too far. In the Middle Ages, you didn't get bells. You got buried quickly because back then, the body wasn't meant to linger. Death moved fast, and so did funerals thanks to hygiene, fear of spirits, and limited fridge space, i.e. no fridge at all. If your color changed, if your breath slowed, if your eyes rolled back well, someone was digging before your toes cooled. And if you weren't truly gone, well, there's a story recorded in Bohemia about a man who was declared dead after collapsing at the harvest. He was buried, and 3 days later, the gravedigger returned to find the earth disturbed. The coffin had split. Inside, the man had turned over. His hands were bloody, and here's the best part. His mouth was full of shredded cloth. He'd chewed through his burial shroud in panic. Some historians say these stories were moral tales, reminders to live piously, lest you wake in the dark with unconfessed sins. Others think they were just real tragedies, with the folklore part grafted on later. Either way, the sleep of death wasn't always so permanent. You feel the dread of medieval people, how uncertain they were about what death even meant. Was it instant? Was it gradual? Could you hover between worlds, like a candle flickering before it finally gutters out? It's no wonder they feared sleep so much. How do you know the difference between a nap and eternal rest when both look like stillness? In some towns, to test for death, they'd hold a mirror to your lips. No fog, time for the funeral. Others poked you with hot irons. Charming. There's even a story of a 14th century noblewoman whose supposed death was interrupted when her husband, distraught and ready to say goodbye, kissed her and she stirred. She lived. Apparently love conquers coma. Or the fear of being buried with unfinished business. Quirkier still, a few traditions buried people with tools just in case. A small hammer, a sharp stick, a bell if you were lucky. In Ireland, some folktales tell of people buried with a loaf of bread and a candle, very thoughtful. Especially if you suddenly wake up mid-dirt nap and get peckish. And then there were the waiters. No, not the food kind. These were designated watchers who sat with the recently deceased, usually for 24 hours, to make sure the body didn't, undie. These folks were called sin eaters in some parts because they also performed rituals to absorb the deceased's sins by eating bread or drinking ale beside the body. Double-duty spiritual sanitation and early warning system. The line between death and sleep wasn't just blurred, it was scary, unreliable, and deeply tied to medieval theology. If you were buried alive, it wasn't just a terrible mistake, it could be a damnation problem. What if your soul got confused? What if it didn't know whether to leave or stay? Historians still argue whether early burial stories were mostly parables or isolated freak incidents, but there are enough recorded cases to make you want to nap with one eye open, especially during plague years, when people were carted off by the dozen and dumped in pits. Efficiency, not accuracy, ruled the day. You lean against a damp headstone now and let the unease settle. In medieval Europe, sleep and death shared the same bed, sometimes literally. You weren't just risking fever dreams. You might lie down and never know if you'd wake up in your home or a hole. A priest might mumble prayers over your body while you were dreaming of soup, and no one wants to be buried while dreaming of soup. Still, there's something oddly peaceful about the idea that maybe, just maybe, people learned to sleep carefully, gently, listening inward, checking in with their bodies before letting go completely. Imagine that a society so attuned to the boundary between life and sleep that every night carried the weight of a tiny rehearsal for the end. So tonight, when you settle in and feel yourself drifting, just whisper, "Not yet." It worked for them. Probably. You roll away from the idea of being accidentally entombed and land softly into another curiously uncomfortable truth about sleep in the Middle Ages. It was rarely uninterrupted. You're not dreaming this. The people of medieval Europe didn't sleep in one long stretch like we expect today. They took their rest in two neat chunks. First sleep, then second sleep. This is where things get strange, but also oddly cozy. You imagine settling into your straw-filled mattress just after sunset, maybe warmed by the glow of a dying hearth. You drift off somewhere around 8 or 9 p.m., snuggled in close with your siblings, spouse, or goat. No judgment. It was drafty and livestock gave off free body heat. The house is silent, except for the familiar creaks of wood and occasional sleepy mumble from someone mid-dream. Then sometime around midnight you wake up, not fully, not with a jolt, but calmly, as though nudged by some internal medieval alarm clock. You sit up, you maybe say a prayer, tend to the fire, nibble on a cold oatcake. Some people even visited neighbors for a chat, or how medieval of them engage in a bit of intimacy. The midnight hour was oddly social, all things considered. This gap between the first and second sleeps lasted about an hour or two, and then, just as naturally, people would drift back into slumber until morning. It was so routine, so expected that it appeared in literature, diaries, and legal records. One English physician even advised patients that this midnight interlude was the best time for contemplation when the mind was most clear. Try telling that to your 2A my brain as it spirals through 400 embarrassing memories. Mainstream historians agree that biphasic sleep was once the norm, especially before artificial lighting took over the night, but how it disappeared so thoroughly is still debated. Was it the rise of gas lamps coffee culture, the Industrial Revolution's obsession with tight schedules, or maybe the simple terror of insomnia being labeled a sleep disorder instead of a nightly intermission? Historians still argue whether this return to a natural rhythm might be healthier for modern people. 2. Sleep studies in the 90s showed that when participants were left without artificial light, many of them reverted to first and second sleep patterns within weeks. So maybe your 3 almond wake-ups aren't insomnia, maybe they're time travel. You shuffle further into this medieval nightscape where time ticks to a slower rhythm. Churches mark the hours with bells, not alarms, and no one panics when they stir awake. You're not late, you're just in between. During this waking interval, people prayed a lot. Monasteries had entire schedules built around night prayers called matins or vigils, which monks would chant in cold chapels while the rest of the world yawned between slumbers. And for the secular folks, the interlude wasn't always religious. Some cooked, some tended to livestock, some read if they could afford candles or had the literacy. A few swore by midnight as the best time for herbal remedies. Herbs brewed between sleeps were said to hold extra potency, as if the world itself was closer to magic during the half-night hush. You stretch out, imagining your own dream schedule cut in half. Would your nightmares wait politely until second sleep? Would your dreams continue where they left off like a medieval Netflix binge, pausing just before the big reveal? There's even a strange little theory tucked in the corners of folklore that witches, fairies, and other nighttime beings were most active between sleeps. It was a liminal hour, a no man's land when people were awake, but the world wasn't. If you've ever had that eerie 2 a.m. feeling that something was watching you from the foot of the bed, well, the medieval folks felt the same. They just had the decency to blame it on sprites. This in-between time may have felt mystical, or at least more connected. You knew your neighbors were up. 2, the fire needed stoking. A child might need soothing. You might peer out the window and see a light across the lane, a flickering sign that you weren't alone in this quiet communion with the dark. And remember that dream you were having in a world without alarm clocks or blue light screens. Dreams felt weightier. Sleep was sacred, yes, but so was waking, because it didn't mean the end of rest. It just meant pause. You imagine the reverse of your modern life. Instead of fighting to get your full 8 hours, you're expected to stir, reflect, even socialize in the middle of the night. It's no wonder medieval writings often describe sleep as being taken in parts, like sips of wine, not one gulp. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, characters reference their first sleep without needing to explain. It was that common. Theories abound about the origins of biphasic sleep. Was it tied to the sun's pattern or to the cold of night, when fires needed feeding and blankets needed fluffing? Some believe it was spiritual, the waking time seen as a holy gap, a place between this world and the next. Others argue it was more practical, nature's alarm system to make sure your roof hadn't collapsed or your goat hadn't wandered off. Nothing like a little livestock panic to get the blood pumping. Then again, perhaps it was both. In the Middle Ages, there wasn't a firm line between spiritual and practical. Everything had meaning, and everything had consequence. You smile a little as you imagine explaining this sleep rhythm to a modern sleep therapist. No, I'm not anxious. I'm just between sleeps. It has a ring to it, and maybe in that old rhythm, there's something to reclaim a softer way to meet the night. Not as a sprint toward morning, but as a meandering walk with a few rest stops. So, if you find yourself wide awake at 2:47 a.m., don't panic. You're not broken. You might just be medieval. You barely blink. And now you're gliding across muddy fields and timbered towns to land right in the heart of something so sweet, so deceptively cozy, that it could have lulled the entire Middle Ages into a sugar coma, except, of course, for the part where it kills you, tonight's bedtime candy. Let's talk about sleeping drafts. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, or maybe an unlucky noble with chronic back pain from all those heavy crowns and guilt. You're desperate for sleep. The sheep aren't cutting it. The rooster won't shut up. And your bed is made of, let's be honest, hay and regret. So what do? You call on the local herbalist, who opens her dusty cabinet of secrets and brews you a potion, a warm, dark liquid laced with herbs like poppy, henbane, hemlock, mandrake. Sounds relaxing, right? A little botanical bedtime tea, except many of these herbs are, how shall we say, wildly toxic. Sleeping drafts were essentially medieval NyQuil. If NyQuil came with a 25% chance of death and a 100% chance of vivid hallucinations, 1 minute you're counting stars through a cracked ceiling, and the next you're convinced the Virgin Mary is dancing with a goat in your fireplace. The standard formula varied by region, but most included a mix of sedatives and anesthetics derived from plants, some of which we now classify as dangerous poisons. Poppy was the friendliest, offering opium-like effects, mandrake strong but temperamental, henbane mildly hallucinogenic, often resulting in visions of flying, great for bedtime stories, not so great for avoiding accidental self-defenestration. Historians still argue whether these potions were effective sleep aids or just a folkloric placebo with a dash of psychosis. Some say they genuinely worked, knocking people out for hours, maybe days. Others point to cases where patients simply never woke up, victims of overdosing in a time when precise measurement was about as reliable as a squirrel with a ruler. Still, medieval folks trusted their herbalists, and to be fair, it wasn't like they had much choice. If you couldn't sleep and didn't want to be labeled possessed or worse, a witch downing a questionable elixir was often your best bet. Here's the kicker. These sleeping potions weren't just used for insomnia. Surgeons, yes, medieval ones sometimes used them to knock out patients before sawing off a limb or draining a boil. Drink this, the surgeon would say, holding out what was essentially poison soup in a clay cup. You'll feel no pain. You also might never feel anything again. You lie back now and try to imagine sipping one of these concoctions, eyes fluttering shut as the room spins and your body sinks into something heavier than rest. It's easy to see how some people never made it back, and yet the promise of dreamless sleep was often worth the risk. There's a quirky side to all this, too. Some recipes included wine soaked with lettuce leaves, which sounds kind of quaint until you realize that lettuce wine was also used to quiet screaming infants. Here, little Timmy, a nice, boozy salad to knock you out. There are medieval lullabies, folks, and then there are medieval cocktails. And in case you're wondering, yes, these sleep concoctions made it into royal courts as well. Kings and queens had their own apothecaries, tasked with mixing drafts that would soothe royal nerves or, occasionally, knock out inconvenient relatives, because nothing says family bonding like slipping dad a drop of nightshade before dinner. The fear of being poisoned while asleep led to some interesting bedtime habits among the elite. Food tasters were a given, of course, but some nobles went as far as commissioning elaborate locking mechanisms for their bedrooms or insisting on sleeping in towers, surrounded by loyal guards and very uncomfortable furniture. Imagine trying to get your 8 hours while chained to the concept of betrayal. One notable fringe theory, though, debated suggests that some sleeping potions were designed not just to induce rest, but to simulate death. This might sound far-fetched, but it's not completely beyond reason. If you wanted to fake your demise for escape, revenge, or dramatic flair. A heavy sleeping draft might do the trick. There are apocryphal tales of nobles dying, being entombed, and later waking up inside a crypt. That's less bedtime and more nightmare fuel, which brings us back, with a groggy blink, to our favorite question: did these people really think this was restful? Maybe they did. In a world without white noise machines or sleep podcasts, the option to chemically knock yourself unconscious was seen as progress. Sure, there were risks, but there were also nights when the winds howled, the wolves barked, and your feet were dangerously close to a bedpan. Some risks were worth it. Even today, modern medicine still borrows from the medieval herb cabinet. Valerian root, once used in sleeping drafts, is now available in pill form at your local health food store. Lavender, once bundled into medieval pillows to soothe the devil's dreams, now comes in spray bottles marketed for your memory foam mattress. So maybe, as you adjust your blanket and listen to the hum of your fan, you're not so different from your medieval counterpart. You're still chasing rest, still soothing a worried brain, just without the risk of mild poison. Well, hopefully, and if you ever struggle to fall asleep, just imagine someone in 1310 carefully boiling down a root that smells like feet and hoping it'll shut off their anxious thoughts. Imagine them sipping from a cracked mug and praying for dreams instead of demons. It won't knock you out cold like Mandrake, but it might just make you feel a little less alone in the night. You blink again, and the world around you shifts into something softer, less fire and fear, more feathers and shadows. You're stepping now into a medieval bedroom, not a noble's chamber full of silk and suspicion, but something humbler. Straw mattress, wool blanket, maybe a wooden crucifix nailed crookedly above the bed. The smell is a mix of smoke, sheep fat, and whatever passed for soap. And yet, there's something deeply familiar here, because tonight you're going to bed. Now here's the part you don't expect: you're not sleeping the night straight through. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't a single stretch of unconscious bliss. Instead, people followed what's called segmented sleep, 2 distinct chunks, with a watch period in the middle. You'd sleep for a few hours after sunset, wake up sometime after midnight, stay up for maybe an hour or two, and then go back to bed for a second round. This idea of biphasic sleep wasn't just a quirk, it was normal. People expected it. And during that middle wakeful period, they didn't lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering why their circadian rhythm hated them. They got stuff done: prayers, quiet work, maybe a trip outside to check the animals or do a little, intimacy. Medieval records even casually reference the first sleep and second sleep as if it's the most natural thing in the world. Historians still argue whether this pattern was universal or just common in certain regions or classes. Some say it was primarily European and tied closely to artificial light or the lack thereof. Others suggest that biphasic sleep may actually be humanity's default mode, disrupted only in recent centuries by electric lights, screen time, and 2 a.m. TikTok spirals. Quirky fact-time monks in certain orders had their own twist on segmented sleep. Some would rise in the dead of night to chant and pray, following strict rules that turned even bedtime into a kind of spiritual choreography. The Benedictines, for instance, had a 2 a.m. wake-up call for vigils. Can you imagine getting up for work at 2, singing in Latin, then going back to sleep like that was perfectly fine? And here's another oddity. People wrote letters, held quiet conversations, even snuck off to other houses during this in-between phase. There's even a medieval medical text that recommends it as a good time for conceiving children. Nothing like a midnight rendezvous lit by a flickering oil lamp and the soft creak of thatch. You pause here, listening to the sounds of night around you, the imagined scratching of rats in the wall, the occasional wheeze of your neighbor through the shared air vent, the crackling of a low fire trying very hard not to go out. This is when medieval life felt most intimate, when the busyness of survival finally went quiet. And in that stillness, People whispered things, secrets, dreams, fears. Some probably just lay there wondering if their sleeping draft would backfire. Of course, not everyone could afford to follow this dreamy sleep cycle. Urban dwellers working odd hours, guards on night shifts, and innkeepers waiting on drunk travelers had to scrap together whatever rest they could find. Just lie down wherever. You imagine them muttering, as long as it's not next to the chamber pot. What's really funny, and maybe just a little cozy, is how some people turn the space between sleeps into a kind of mini life. There are diaries that describe the watch period as a quiet joy. You'd sit near the hearth, wrap yourself in a shawl, and enjoy a snack or read aloud if you were lucky enough to be literate. One record even mentions a man who used his watch time to repair shoes, nighttime cobbling, because why not? There's something strangely appealing about this lost rhythm. You wonder what it would feel like to rise in the middle of the night, not with panic, but with purpose. No phone, no urgent emails, just you, the fire, and a soft hour of stillness before drifting back into that second round of sleep. Some modern researchers have even experimented with returning to this ancient pattern. When people are removed from artificial light, they often fall naturally into segmented sleep. Their brains just do it. It's almost like the medieval mind knew something we forgot, or maybe they just had more practice with moonlight and boredom. There's even a fringe theory that the watch period allowed for deeper creativity. Some artists and inventors claim their best ideas arrived not during the chaos of the day, but in those drowsy hours when the world was quiet and the mind wandered free. Who knew insomnia could be so productive? Still, not everyone loved it. There were always those who couldn't fall back asleep or who found the interruption jarring. One priest even called it the devil's hour, blaming nighttime wakefulness on sin, gluttony, or lazy piety, because naturally, if you're awake at 2 a.m., it's because you're morally defective, not just worried about rent or wondering what owl that was outside your window. So here you are, in the soft belly of the medieval night. You've finished your first sleep. The fire is still glowing. Someone is snoring down the hall. You sit up quietly, maybe nibble on leftover pottage, and listen. Somewhere, someone is praying. Somewhere else, someone is sneaking out of bed and hoping the floorboards don't creak. And you're just breathing, watching, being. It's oddly comforting to think that for hundreds of years, people found rest not in a single block of time, but in pieces. They made peace with imperfection, with interruption, with moonlight slicing across their faces and sleep that came in waves. And eventually, you lie back down. You pull the blanket over your chin, and just like they did, you wait for the second sleep to come. Somewhere between the hush of second sleep and the cock's insistent crow, you roll over into another time, another place. This time, it's less about how people slept and more about what they dreamed, or rather, what they believed those dreams meant. And oh, you're going to love this one, because the medieval world didn't just dabble in dream interpretation, it obsessed over it. You stir into the mind of a medieval dreamer, somewhere in the 13th century, tucked under a woolen blanket and chewing through visions of flying pigs or crying saints. In that moment, you're not just wondering if last night's dream about falling teeth meant stress. You're wondering if it was a divine warning, a demonic prank, or possibly an early sign that someone nearby was about to die. Dreams were serious business back then. Religious leaders, physicians, poets, and common folks alike believed that dreams were messages from God or worse, from the devil. Depending on your social station and your spiritual leanings, you might interpret your dreams with a Bible in one hand and a bucket of salt in the other. Mainstream fact. The medieval church tried to regulate dream interpretation. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas walked a tightrope, yes. God could speak through dreams after all. He visited Joseph in a few, but the devil, oh, he was a crafty sleeper. The idea that your subconscious could be manipulated by dark forces, meant that dream analysis wasn't something to do casually, like reading a horoscope in the tavern newsletter. Still, the average person couldn't help themselves. There were dream manuals circulating in Latin and vernacular languages, full of confident interpretations. Dream of fish, wealth is coming. Dream of your teeth falling out. Someone in your family might die. Dream of flying. That could go either way depending on how many feathers were involved. You might chuckle now, but admit it, you've Googled dream about spiders more than once, haven't you? One of the more fringe beliefs was that dreams could predict weather. No, really, some medieval farmers believed that dreaming of fire meant drought, while dreaming of frogs indicated rain. In hindsight, maybe not the best method for planning your harvest, but hey, when your entire calendar revolves around saints and crop rotations, you take what you can get. Historians still argue whether dreams were more of a personal or communal affair during this time. Did people keep their dreams to themselves or share them over breakfast like supernatural gossip? Some records suggest that particularly vivid dreams were discussed publicly, especially if they involved kings, wars, or ominous comets. Others hint that dreams were deeply private, a sort of medieval diary with celestial ink. Imagine waking from a terrifying vision in which your village is consumed by wolves. Do you tell your neighbors? Do you warn the priest? Or do you quietly double knot your boots, just in case? Another curious detail: dreams were sometimes admissible in court. Let that one float for a second. In some parts of medieval Europe, a dream could be used as supporting evidence, not standalone proof. Mind you, but if you claim that a murdered man appeared to you in a dream and named his killer, well, the judge might raise an eyebrow, but the townspeople might raise a pitchfork. Some monarchs even claimed that dreams guided their decisions. One famously recounted dreaming of a white stag before ordering a campaign into enemy territory. It didn't end well, but the symbolism chef's kiss. A few nobles even consulted dream interpreters before marriage. Nothing says romance like asking, "Did you dream about goats or knives last night?" One especially charming belief was that certain foods could influence your dreams. Cheese, of course, was the prime culprit. Eat hard cheese before bed, you might dream of violence. Soft cheese, romantic entanglements. There's even a late medieval recipe for a dreamless sleep potion, which, suspiciously, contained a lot of wine. You don't say. And let's not forget the monks and mystics. Some religious orders placed enormous value on dreams as vehicles of spiritual insight. A nun might record a dream in which she walked with angels and interpret it as a sign of divine favor or as a warning about pride. The line between hallucination and heavenly message was gossamer thin, sometimes literally the width of a candle flame. Now, back to you. You're lying there after your second sleep, blinking at the ceiling and trying to remember whether your dream involved a goose or a bishop or both. You can hear a rooster in the distance. Morning is coming, but in your mind, you're still floating somewhere between the real and the unreal. What if your dream was a sign, a warning, a promise, or maybe just a side effect of eating too much leek soup and stewed plum? Your breath slows. You feel the scratchy weave of the blanket. You imagine a medieval mother gently asking her child what they dreamed about, hoping for a vision of Saint Michael and not a giant talking badger, which would mean mischief ahead. And while modern science explains dreams as the brain sorting out memory, emotion, and stray input like a cosmic sock drawer, there's still something deliciously mysterious about the way medieval folks treated them, like miniature prophecies, slipping in when the world is quietest. You can almost picture a village waking together, slowly comparing dreams like puzzle pieces. You saw a bleeding moon. Haha, I dreamed of drowning goats. Weird. And just like that, your own dream fades too into memory, into myth, into the thick soup of stories passed down for generations. One person's nightmare is another's holy vision. One village's superstition becomes another century's curiosity. As daylight creeps into the room, the dreams retreat. But for one last moment, you cling to them. A dancing cat, a flying lute, a tree that whispered your name. You sigh, content in the knowledge that once upon a time, even the silliest dream might have changed the course of someone's life or at least caused a village-wide cheese ban. You roll over, one arm flopping out of your blanket cocoon, and find yourself stumbling into a time when the line between health and sleep was blurrier than your vision at 3 a.m. Yes, we're talking medieval medicine now, and how, for some reason, it always seemed to circle back to sleep. Humors, or brace yourself leeches. Picture it, your head aches, your dreams are restless, and the town's most reputable healer suggests you've got too much black bile. What do? You nod. Of course, you thank her. You go home and apply a poultice of boiled fennel, sheep's wool, and, just for fun, a dab of goat butter, because in medieval Europe, sleep wasn't just a byproduct of health, it was a barometer for it. Mainstream fact, the theory of the four humors dominated medicine. Your body, they believed, was made of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor had a corresponding temperament, season, element, and yes, sleep pattern. Too much black bile. Melancholy and insomnia, too much phlegm, sleepy and sluggish, too much blood. You guessed it, dreams so vivid, they'd make a modern therapist sweat. Doctors didn't just observe your symptoms, they asked how you were sleeping. Were you waking too early? Did you snore? Did your dreams involve floating monks or melting bread? All relevant, obviously. And while bleeding was often prescribed, because who doesn't feel better after losing half a pint, sometimes sleep itself was the cure. You'd be told to rest under a specific moon phase, wear a heated wool sock, or sleep with a frog under your pillow. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether the frog was meant to absorb illness or simply make you too uncomfortable to remember you were sick. The beds themselves were a kind of medicine. If you were rich, you slept on layers of down-stuffed mattresses, surrounded by heavy curtains to trap warmth and dampen noise. If you were poor, you got straw, and if you were really unlucky, your bed might be a bench near the hearth, your dreams haunted by smoke and the occasional rat nibble. Sleepwalking, that was definitely a spiritual problem. Maybe demonic possession, maybe just too much wine. But either way, if you were caught wandering the halls mid-dream, expect a stern talking to and probably some holy water splashed on your toes. And then there were the so-called sleeping illnesses. Entire villages reportedly fell asleep for days at a time. The explanations range from mass hysteria to moldy bread to divine punishment for poor attendance at mass. Quirky tidbit. One chronicler describes a town where people just fell asleep, standing up, and had to be propped against trees like forgotten scarecrows. You adjust your pillow, trying to imagine a medieval infirmary. Herbs hung from the rafters. A patient moans gently in the corner, dreaming feverish dreams of fish and fire. The healer mixes crushed rose petals with honey and wine, hoping it soothes more than just the tongue. And somewhere nearby, a learned man copies out Galen's teachings by candlelight, scribbling in the margins. Patient fell asleep mid-bleed, promising. Medieval medicine often viewed sleep as a balance, not just rest. Too much sleep was slothful, even dangerous. Not enough risked madness. And if you were an intellectual, say, a monk or a scribe, sleep was a luxury. You were constantly guilt-tripping yourself for enjoying. Think of it as the medieval version of grind culture, just with more Latin and fewer protein shakes. But not all sleep remedies were terrifying. Some were surprisingly gentle. Lavender sachets, warm milk with cinnamon, reciting psalms until your eyes fluttered shut. There was a belief that reading the lives of saints before bed helped you sleep better. Though, let's be honest, if someone's story ends with them getting eaten by lions for the 5th time, it's probably more of a thriller. And then, of course, there were the lunar charts. Many medieval folks believed that the moon dictated sleep cycles. Certain nights were unlucky for rest. Others were perfect for deep sleep and meaningful dreams. Some calendars even warned, "Do not sleep on the fifth night of the new moon, lest misfortune come." No pressure. Monasteries were perhaps the strangest blend of discipline and dreams. Monks often woke multiple times in the night to pray. Their sleep was fragmented but intentional. They'd nap briefly after dinner, rise for midnight prayers, then rest again until dawn. In a way, they accidentally perfected segmented sleep centuries before modern science rediscovered it. You lie there now, half drowsy, and wonder what it would feel like to wake at midnight to chant in candlelight. Maybe peaceful, maybe maddening. Either way, your Fitbit would not be pleased. Interestingly, one treatment for insomnia involved listening, not to music, but to long, slow readings, scriptures, sermons, occasionally a poem if the healer was feeling fancy. It was believed that certain rhythms lulled the body into surrender. You smile. Perhaps you're not so different from a 14th century peasant, after all just swapping out psalms for sleepy podcasts. There's even a charming record of a noble woman who cured her nighttime restlessness by counting beans, literal beans. She'd line them up on the windowsill, whisper their names, and drift off somewhere between Navy and Pinto, a rustic ASMR, centuries ahead of its time. And through all of this, sleep remained both a mystery and a mirror. You were told to guard your dreams, to monitor your breath, to notice the color of your urine in the morning as proof of how deeply you'd rested. Yes, that was a thing. Yellow was good, brown was bad, glitter, definitely a curse. Some sleep advice was wildly counterintuitive. Sleep on your left side to aid digestion, but not too long, or demons might settle near your heart. Don't sleep near mirrors, don't sleep during an eclipse, and never sleep with your feet pointing east unless you wanted to tempt fate or wake with a cramp so intense it required 3 saints and a goat sacrifice to undo. You stretch, eyes still closed, half expecting to hear the whisper of a healer gently reminding you to balance your humors. Sleep, they believed, was not just the body resting, it was the soul wandering, the blood rebalancing, the night unfolding quietly within you. And while we've traded the frog pillows for memory foam, the essence remains. Sleep is something we still don't fully understand. It cradles us, cures us, sometimes even confuses us. Just maybe skip the leeches. Yeah, you blink slowly, eyes heavy now, but your journey through the strange side alleys of sleep isn't quite over, because tonight you find yourself tangled in the twilight between dreams and death, the edge where sleep turns sinister, and where history quietly whispers tales of those who closed their eyes and didn't exactly wake up, not from illness, not from war, but from sleep itself or something oddly next to it. Let's begin with a case that sounds suspiciously like bedtime gone very, very wrong. In 1518 in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea began to dance, not just a little jig, but an uncontrollable, all-consuming, twitchy shuffle that didn't stop. People gathered, more joined in. Soon, dozens were dancing, eyes glazed, feet blistered. Some danced to death. Mainstream historians now call it the dancing plague. Yes, a real thing, a spontaneous outbreak of rhythmic chaos, and possibly the worst group workout in recorded history. Scholars still argue whether it was a form of mass psychogenic illness, contaminated bread triggering hallucinations, or something more celestial. And what's wild is that these dancers weren't energized, they were exhausted. Many collapsed mid-step, unconscious, or, in a few tragic cases, permanently still. It's as if sleep tried to claim them mid-movement and refused to let go. And speaking of involuntary naps, let's float over to 18th century England, where the term sudden death in sleep became oddly common in court records. usually labeled with vague phrases like visitation by God or death by fright. These mysterious ends often involved no visible illness. People simply went to bed and didn't wake up. There's one peculiar case of a London baker's apprentice, barely 16, who fell asleep after working the night shift and was found the next morning still holding a biscuit. The coroner's report: expired by way of heavenly slumber. Poetic, but not helpful. Quirky tidbit: during this period, some people began to sleep sitting up, terrified that lying flat might invite the reaper. High-backed chairs with padded arms became unofficial sleeping furniture. Imagine catching a nap like a Victorian bat, upright and anxious. But perhaps no sleep-adjacent death is stranger or sadder than the fate of Sigurd the Mighty, a 9th century Norse earl. After defeating an enemy in battle, he tied the man's severed head to his saddle as a victory trophy. Problem one of the head's teeth cut his leg during the ride home. Infection set in. Days later, Sigurd drifted into fevered sleep and never woke again, killed by a dead man's molar. Rest in irony. Now, not all strange sleep deaths were real. Some were just perceived to be. During the Middle Ages, the fear of being buried alive became oddly fashionable. Physicians began devising methods to distinguish sleep, coma, and actual death: pinching, feather under the nose, holding a mirror to the lips, and yes, poking the foot with a hot iron. Comforting, right? You shift under your blanket, grateful nobody's checking your pulse with a fireplace poker. This paranoia led to the invention of the safety coffin, a casket equipped with a bell, string, or breathing tube, just in case you decided to wake up a few feet underground. Some even had viewing ports, so loved ones could peek in every few hours, like checking on a sourdough starter. Sleep paralysis, too, was often mistaken for something far more sinister. In early folklore, people believed it was caused by nocturnal demons, most famously the Mara in Norse mythology. She'd sit on your chest, stealing your breath and joy. Later, in Renaissance Europe, the same symptoms were blamed on witches, ghosts, or your slightly suspicious neighbor with one too many cats. Mainstream fact: sleep paralysis is a real phenomenon, tied to disruptions between REM sleep and wakefulness. But try explaining that to a 15th century peasant gasping for breath while feeling invisible fingers press into his ribs. In some parts of Eastern Europe, particularly among Slavic cultures, strange deaths during sleep were often blamed on vampires. Yes, people who died suddenly, especially if they looked too peaceful, were suspected of rising again. Measures included turning the body face down, placing poppy seeds in the coffin to keep the undead too busy counting, or the classic: a wooden stake through the heart. Historians still argue whether these traditions stemmed more from folklore or from early attempts to explain disease transmission, like tuberculosis, but the link between peaceful slumber and potential horror remained unsettlingly firm. And then there's the case of the Sleepy Hollow of Kazakhstan, a real town, Kalachi, where for several years, starting in 2013, people kept falling asleep, randomly, in the street, at work, during lunch. Some slept for days. Scientists eventually pointed to nearby uranium mines and potential gas leaks, but nothing was ever officially confirmed. Just imagine walking your goat, and then boom, nap time. One local girl reportedly slept through her birthday, 2 school days, and a wedding she was meant to flower girl in. She woke up craving cake and confused why she'd missed so much of Downton Abbey. Honestly, relatable. These stories make you wonder how fragile is the line between sleep and oblivion, between sweet dreams and final ones. Even in literature, the idea lingers. Think of Shakespeare's Hamlet, who famously muses that to die, to sleep no more, and then questions what dreams may come in that final sleep. A haunting thought? Or Macbeth, who laments that sleep is the balm of hurt minds but finds himself denied it, cursed with endless waking guilt. We've always given sleep a kind of reverence, wrapped it in myth, medicine, fear, and fascination, whether it's a peaceful drift into nothingness or a battleground of demons and spirits. It's never just shutting your eyes. It's always something more, and maybe that's why we still tuck ourselves in like ritual, why we draw the curtains, fluff the pillow just so, or fall into routines that signal our bodies. It's safe now, you can let go, because the edge of sleep is, in its own quiet way, a little bit sacred. As your breathing evens out, you imagine an old monk quietly lighting a candle beside your bed, not to ward off evil or measure your pulse, but just to watch the flame flicker, a reminder that even in the dark, there's still a glow. That maybe not always, but often sleep holds more peace than peril. You shift again, blanket warm, heart steady, and this time, no dancing plagues, no vampire theories, just you, the hush of night, and that curious comfort in knowing that people for thousands of years have done this same thing, closed their eyes, let the world slip away, and surrendered, if only for a while, to the strange, delicate art of sleeping. You're nearly at the edge now of both history and consciousness. The stories are getting softer, the pace slower, and your thoughts are beginning to blur at the corners. But before you drift too far, there's one final path to wander down, the delicate, mysterious line where dream turns to vision and sleep becomes a door to something deeper or weirder. Tonight, you're reclining beside some of history's most sleep-obsessed minds, people who didn't just snore through the night, but who built philosophies, therapies, and yes, entire religions around what sleep might mean. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, where dreaming wasn't just a brain glitch, it was divine Wi-Fi. Kings employed professional dream interpreters, known as Baru, who would analyze your dreams using thick clay tablets and elaborate omens. Dreamt of a flooded river that meant abundance. Dreamt of a tooth falling out. Well, brace yourself, literally. One real king, Ashurbanipal of Assyria, kept an entire library of dreams, not just his, but everyone's. He believed dreams were coded messages from gods, ancestors, or cosmic forces. If you woke up without dreaming, a bad sign, someone in the underworld must have missed their nightly appointment. Historians still argue whether these interpretations influence actual state decisions or were more like ancient therapy sessions. So, Your Majesty, tell me again about the eagle in the fountain. In a quirkier twist, certain Mesopotamian temples even had designated sleep chambers where pilgrims could nap and receive healing visions. It's like ancient spa meets lucid dream workshop. Side note, the mattress probably wasn't memory foam, it was more like reeds with ambition. Next, glide gently into classical Greece, where sleep was personified as Hypnos, a winged god who lived in a dark cave surrounded by poppies and mist. He had a twin brother, Thanatos, aka Death. Yep, the gods literally saw sleep and death as siblings who shared a bedroom. Cozy, in Homer's Iliad, warriors falling asleep are often compared to dying, and vice versa. When Hypnos touches your eyes, you drift. When Thanatos does, you don't come back. It's comforting in a mythological, slightly ominous way. Now, if you were sick in ancient Greece, you might be sent to a temple of Asclepius, god of medicine. There, you'd participate in a ritual called incubation, which was basically medical napping. You'd fast, purify yourself, then sleep in a sacred room, hoping the god would appear in your dreams with a diagnosis. Hello, mortal. Cut back on goat cheese. Mainstream fact, the temple at Epidaurus was so popular that people carved their dream healings into stone tablets outside, sort of like Yelp reviews. But for divine sleep therapy, over in medieval Europe, though, sleep had become more of a moral tightrope. Too much of it sloth, too little pride. Monks lived by strict sleep schedules, waking up to chant through the night like divine alarm clocks. In some monastic communities, the second sleep practice persisted. Remember that middle of the night wake-up break? Monks used that time to pray or read. Regular folks, they used it to, Well, let's just say they weren't all praying. Some scholars suggest that second sleep was peak gossip time. Imagine whispering scandal under candlelight while nibbling on stale bread. Fast forward to the 17th century, and sleep starts getting scientific. One French doctor, Jean-Jacques Monge, published a 1,000-page book on sleep disorders, 1,000 pages, about OAT, not being awake. It included everything from nightmares to sleep drunkenness, which was the term for waking up groggy and confused, or, as we now call it, Monday. And in a strange medical footnote, some 18th century doctors believed excessive dreaming was caused by too much blood in the brain. Their solution leeches. You dream too vividly. And, next thing you know, you've got 3 slimy freeloaders on your temples. Sleep tight. Quirky tidbit: one Italian noblewoman was so terrified of dreams that she had her servants ring tiny bells every time she entered REM sleep. The moment she twitched ding 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 up, she popped, probably exhausted. But hey, very dream-free. As time crept forward, Victorian sleep culture grew more structured. Bedrooms became sanctuaries, curtains drawn, clocks muffled, windows slightly cracked for fresh air. There were entire etiquette guides on how to sleep properly. For instance, a lady must not snore. A gentleman must remove his watch before bed, lest he dream of time unraveling. But it wasn't all lace and lavender. In 1845, a man named Alfred Maury recorded a dream in which he was guillotined during the French Revolution, and in the dream, he felt the blade. As he woke up, a piece of his bed's headboard fell and struck his neck. Historians still argue whether the sound caused the dream or the dream anticipated the sound. Either way, Maury stopped eating cheese before bed. You chuckle softly, thinking of all the odd things people have done to manage, manipulate, or understand sleep. Sleep journals, dream dictionaries, nap schedules. Even now, you might track your sleep with a watch, a phone, or that weird ring that buzzes at 4 a.m. to tell you you're stressed. But at its core, sleep hasn't changed. It's still you, closing your eyes, letting go of control, and hoping to land in a place both peaceful and strange. A realm where history occasionally visits you, disguised as a lion, or a staircase, or a missed final exam. You breathe in. The air feels still. Maybe tonight, you'll dream of temples carved into hillsides, of kings and monks, dancers and dreamers, each slipping into the same quiet surrender, the great leveling experience shared by everyone from sultans to stable boys. Or maybe you'll just snore into your pillow and wake up wondering what day it is. That's okay too, because here's the secret: sleep has always been strange and strangely beautiful.